Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8, about civil liberties. It's Lesson 7, about limits on liberties. In this lesson, you will learn about limits on liberties, about strict scrutiny, about the compelling interest test, and about the rational basis test. Let me remind you first of a couple of things that you've learned previously in this unit. We, in a previous lesson, talked about how right and power are sort of two sides of the same coin. We were able to call them the two sides of the same coin because if we consider who controls that coin, it then influences whether we call it a right or a power. If an individual has control of a particular thing, such as in the coin I showed you in the previous slide, the right to bear arms, then we're going to call it a right. The person has the right to have a gun if they want. If, on the other hand, the government has control of that coin, they're the ones that decide whether to regulate that area, whether to put rules on whether people can have guns or not, then we say the government has a power over that area. So it's really the same thing that's being possessed here by one or the other. It's control of this particular aspect of our lives. If individuals control it, we call it a right. If government controls it, we call it a power. So, if you have a right to a thing, in other words, you as an individual control it, then the government has no power over it. On the other hand, if government has power over a thing, then you have no right to it. These things, the way that I explained it previously, is they're exclusive. Either you have the right or the government has the power. And if you have the right, there's nothing they can do about it. If they have the power, there's nothing that you can do about it. But that does then raise a question. Does this mean that your rights are absolute? In other words, if you have control of a particular area, such as free speech, does that mean you can say anything you want? If you have control over the right to bear arms, does that mean you can possess any weapon you want? You see, this raises this issue. Are these rights really absolute because you have the right, and if you don't have power, if you don't have control of it, then the government has power? Which is it? Well, let's look at an example to figure this out. Let's take one of the rights that's protected in the First Amendment. First Amendment says that Congress will make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Okay? Now, just generally speaking, we're going to assume that that means that the government has to leave you alone to practice your religion as you see fit. But what if your religion includes human sacrifice? Here in this slide, you have the depiction of ancient Aztecs sacrificing people, cutting out their beating hearts to appease their sun god. Well, what if that was your religion today? You decide to practice the ancient religion of the Aztecs, and you want to go kill some people. Should the government let you? But what if they don't? Then are they infringing upon your free exercise of your religion, and you don't have a right anymore because they're controlling it? Is it really all or nothing? Let's consider another example. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, generally speaking, that means you can say what you want, particularly about the government. This was one of the most basic protections we have against tyranny. But does that mean you can reveal military secrets during a time of war? If our government is planning the secret, surprise, counterattack invasion, and you find out about it, you have the secret battle plans, can you go put them on your blog for the whole rest of the world to see, or can the government step in and stop you? And if they do step in and stop you, does that mean that you've been now denied your right to freedom of speech and it doesn't exist anymore? Now, I think in these two examples, most Americans would say, all right, yeah, normally I think you should be able to practice your religion, but human sacrifice goes too far. Yeah, normally I think you should be able to say what you want, but revealing our military secrets during a time of war goes too far. So what they're really saying is there's some line beyond which you can take your liberty too far. Yes, in general, you have your liberty and the government should leave you alone. Generally, that's your right and the government is not going to interfere with it. But there is some point where you've gone too far and the government can step in and stop you. Well, okay, if we accept that there's some line that's too far, your freedoms only go to a certain point and then they become invalid. The question must be then, well, if there is a line, where is it at? And who is it that decides that it's at that place? Now, at this point in the course, you should be able to answer at least the second part of that question quite easily. It's going to be the United States Supreme Court that determines where that line is. Well, now, they don't want to get accused of just arbitrarily making stuff up. They don't want you to think that they just look at the case and say, you know, I don't like human sacrifice, so I'll say that's beyond the line. I don't like people giving away military secrets, so I'll say it's beyond the line. That may be, in fact, what they're actually doing, but they don't want you to think that. They want you to think that they are making unbiased opinions, I should say delivering unbiased opinions, unbiased decisions, based on some sort of set rules that don't rely upon their own personal opinions. Now again, you may have already learned in this course that it's quite likely that these decisions are being based upon their personal biases, but they don't want you to know that. So they have to come up with some sort of system to explain why they draw the lines where they do. And the rest of this lesson is going to be explaining that system that they have. So let's create a chart to explain it. We've got a couple of columns and a couple of rows here. Let's let the two rows represent the things that the government might be trying to take away from us. Perhaps they're trying to take our civil liberties away. Perhaps they're trying to take our civil rights away. Now, the civil rights part of this chart is going to have to wait till our next unit. Remember, this unit is about civil liberties, what your freedoms are. The next unit will be about civil rights. In other words, who gets those freedoms. So we're just going to kind of block out the bottom part of this chart and save it for later. So let's just focus on this one row about whether or not the government can take away some of your individual freedoms, your liberties. And let's look at that first cell where the columns and the rows cross. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't you be filling in the column headings? Actually, it's going to be easier to fill in the content of these cells yet first, and then show you what the column headings would be. So in this first cell, we're going to put fundamental freedoms. Now, the reason we're putting that there is because what the Supreme Court does is they say, all right, you claim that some civil liberty that you have has been taken away from the government. The very first thing we're going to do to try to figure out whether you went beyond the line of your protection or they went beyond the line and infringed when they shouldn't, is we're going to figure out what kind of freedom is at issue here. What kind of liberty, what kind of right. And we're going to do that by creating two categories. One category, represented in this cell, is going to be fundamental freedoms. Now let's look and see what's going to be in the other cell beside it. There we are going to put non-fundamental freedoms. Okay, what's the difference here between fundamental freedoms and non-fundamental freedoms? A fundamental freedom is going to be one of our basic constitutional rights. Now, it's kind of vague to define it here because honestly, as you're going to discover as we continue on through this unit, fundamental freedoms end up being whatever the Supreme Court says they are. You may think that you have a list in your own mind of what our fundamental freedoms should be. Maybe you think freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, things like that, fair trial, whatever it may be. Somebody else might disagree with you what that list is. And the Supreme Court has their own list, which, as I said, as we go through this unit, you'll end up discovering that they have eliminated some things from this list that you think maybe should be there, while adding some things that maybe you think shouldn't. But anyway, they've got a list. So they start out by saying, all right, the right you're claiming is either fundamental or it is not fundamental. Now, the non-fundamental thing, you could think of that as just common everyday rights, things that you do in the process of your life where you kind of expect the government will leave you alone, but it's not critically important they do. Okay, like maybe it's a non-fundamental right that you should be able to grow the grass in your yard as long as you want. But if the government actually shows up and says, no, 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 it's time to cut the grass, it hasn't destroyed your freedom as a person for the rest of your life, okay? But on the other hand, if the government shows up and says, you know what, you aren't allowed freedom of speech anymore, that might be a little bit more harmful to us as a society. So, the Supreme Court, first of all, says we've got fundamental freedoms and non-fundamental freedoms. And the reason these are in two separate columns is we're going to treat them differently. So let's first talk about how fundamental freedoms are going to be treated. The Supreme Court says that if the government comes and tries to take away one of these fundamental freedoms, that they as a court are going to apply strict scrutiny to examine what the government has done. Well, what does strict scrutiny mean? Strict scrutiny means that they're going to carefully evaluate whether or not the justification that the government is giving is legitimate. As part of that, they're going to say, all right, not only did you provide us what we consider to be a legitimate justification for this law, but this law is actually serving that justification. So, for example, you couldn't say, well, we want to restrict free speech in order to make sure that we can put a rocket on the moon. Okay, that sort of thing. They'd say, well, wait a minute, what's the connection between free speech and putting a rocket on the moon? We don't see a connection. We don't see that the one serves the other. So even if the one is legitimate, the thing you're trying to pursue is legitimate, this isn't a legitimate way to try to do it by taking people's free speech away. All right, so they're going to apply strict scrutiny. This means that the court is going to carefully go through the law and the reasons that it was enacted to see if, in their opinion, it all makes sense in a good enough way. Well, how good of a way? Well, in this strict scrutiny category, what they say they're looking for then is they examine this law strictly, is they're looking for what they call a compelling interest that would justify what the government is doing. A compelling interest. Well, what's a compelling interest? All right, so for a government to infringe upon somebody's fundamental freedom, whatever the fundamental freedom is, such as freedom of speech, the government is going to have to show that they have a compelling reason to do so. What that word compelling means is that they are compelled. They're almost forced. Even if they didn't want to take that freedom away from you, they have to, because the thing they're trying to protect is so incredibly important. They are forced to take that freedom from you. Let's give you a couple of examples. Let's go back to the idea of human sacrifice. Okay, so we have a freedom here, the right to practice your religion. And let's say that the court decides, oh, okay, that's a fundamental freedom. Well, if it's a fundamental freedom, they're going to apply strict scrutiny to examine it, to make sure that it has a good enough reason behind it being taken away. And then when they're examining it strictly, the test they're going to apply is they're going to say, does the government have a compelling reason to stop you from practicing your religion in this case? And what would the compelling reason be? They need to save the life of the person that you're about to cut the heart out of. That's their compelling reason, is to save that person's life. And therefore, they can, at that point, stop you from practicing your religion. Now, but this may not be the case in other situations. Like, for example, many religions have as part of their worship something called communion, where they will ritually eat and drink something in remembrance of Jesus. So in many of these faiths, this involves taking a drink of wine, which is representative of Christ's blood. They may even have little children who are in the congregation take a sip of the wine. That may be in violation of the laws of that state that say underage children are not to be served alcohol. So what if the government showed up and started arresting the priest and hauling people out and saying, oh, you're in trouble for giving alcohol to a minor, and they went to court? All these people would claim, wait a minute, free exercise of religion. You have to let us practice our religion. Okay, the government say, okay, you're right, free exercise of religion. Let's imagine they then say that's a fundamental freedom. the courts say that. Then what they're going to do is say, does the government have a compelling reason to stop you from giving that 10-year-old kid a sip of wine? Now that's a lot harder than the human sacrifice one. What is it that they're protecting that is so incredibly important to stop that 10-year-old child from taking a little sip of wine? I don't know. It's kind of hard to say that there is something that important to stop them. And so the people would probably win and be able to do their religious practice. So this is where the court claims they're drawing the line, using the compelling interest test. Let's give another example. We talked about, what if you try to reveal secrets during a time of war? The government would say, all right, that's a fundamental freedom of speech. Therefore, we need a compelling reason to stop you. What's the compelling reason? We have to win the war. All right, and so the courts say, yeah, okay, that's probably right. Okay, so for those examples, I hope you understand how the court evaluates these fundamental freedom cases using the compelling interest test. Well, what about the non-fundamental freedoms? What do they use there? They use what they call the rational basis test. Well, what's the rational basis test? When the government is infringing upon a non-fundamental freedom, they merely have to show that they have a rational basis for doing so. And a rational basis means that they have some sort of logical excuse for doing the thing. Now, notice what a much lower standard this is than a compelling interest test. Compelling interest test, it's like, oh my gosh, the world is going to end, some lives are going to end, there's going to be a disaster unless we stop you from doing this thing. Rational basis is, hey, we've got a reasonable excuse for this. Yeah, that we've got some logical thing that we're trying to accomplish. Good enough. We can infringe upon your right. So let me give you what may seem like a silly example to explain this. Let's imagine you're sound asleep in your apartment. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and then suddenly you're woken up by a jackhammer running in the street outside. What's going on is the city's decided to fix a pothole in the street at 3 a.m. And you jump up and run the window and say, I'm going to sue you. You took away my sleep, and you go to court. Now, the court is actually not going to laugh at you. Instead, what they're going to say is, okay, what kind of freedom is at stake here? Is it a fundamental freedom or a non-fundamental freedom? So let's remember from our chart. If it is a non-fundamental freedom, the freedom to sleep in later, to be, sleeping without interference at 3 a.m., then the government only needs a rational basis to be infringing upon it. And I think that's where the courts would put it. They would not say you have a fundamental freedom to sleep anytime you want. They're going to call it non-fundamental. Our society will function even if you lose a little sleep at 3 a.m. So they're going to put it non-fundamental, and then they're going to say, hey, the city just needs a rational basis to be waking you up. And what's the rational basis for running a jackhammer at 3 a.m.? We got to fix the pothole before morning rush hour. All right, they got an excuse. It's logical. They win. That's how rational basis review works. So if it's a non-fundamental freedom that you're claiming was taken, the government only needs a rational reason to take it from you. So now let's remind ourselves, as we've come to understand where these lines are drawn, that it's the Supreme Court that's drawing these lines. And because they're the ones drawing these lines, this effectively gives them the power to create, define, and even destroy rights, depending on where they draw the lines. If they want something to be a right that's going to be preserved, they just claim it's a fundamental freedom, then the government needs a compelling interest to infringe upon it, which most of the time they're not going to have, and suddenly people have this freedom. If they want to get rid of some right, they just say, oh, it's a non-fundamental freedom, which means the government only needs a rational basis to infringe upon it, which means the government almost always wins and gets to do it. They have immense power to decide what our rights are or what our rights are not. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. Who decides the limit of our liberty? Is it us individually? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it Congress? Or is it the state legislature? It's the Supreme Court. Now you may think, wait a minute, aren't I the one that decides the limits of my liberty? You may decide what you do with your liberty, but the Supreme Court is going to decide whether you even actually have a liberty to decide what you do with. How are violations of fundamental freedoms evaluated? With low scrutiny, with intermediate scrutiny, with heightened scrutiny, or with strict scrutiny? With strict scrutiny. They're going to carefully look at the situation. What justification is needed to violate a fundamental freedom? Is it rational basis, intermediate basis, heightened interest, or compelling interest? To violate a fundamental freedom, the government's going to need a compelling interest. And what justification is needed to violate a non-fundamental freedom? Is it a rational basis, an intermediate basis, a heightened interest, or a compelling interest? It is a rational basis that the government only needs to violate a non-fundamental freedom. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 8. It'll be Lesson 8 about the limits that we have on speech.